Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this quick video on subsidies because I think they're interesting and important, and not only does it give you a sense of what happens when there's a subsidy, a per unit subsidy, we might see a supply curve shift. There's also an interesting conversation about deadweight loss, and sometimes we tend to think of subsidies as a really good thing, whereas taxes could be a potentially bad thing, but to an economist, both taxes and subsidies both are inefficient and don't necessarily produce allocatively efficient quantity and can lead to deadweight loss. Okay, that doesn't mean that we never want to have subsidies. In a lot of cases, we know we want subsidies. Sometimes as a society, we wish to have more of a good, and subsidizing is one way to get that, okay, whether it's daycare or COVID vaccines or whatever it might be. So a couple of quick terms, and this is kind of important. Just like taxes, there are two kinds of subsidies: per unit subsidies. So for every single solar panel, for example, that's produced by a firm, the government might subsidize the firm for every single panel. For $20 for every single panel they produce, 100 panels, they get that per unit subsidy. The other kind of subsidy is a lump sum subsidy, just a certain amount of money. Give the firm $20,000. It doesn't matter how much they produce. It's a different type of subsidy. Only the per unit subsidies actually shift the supply curve, so just like taxes, okay? Oftentimes, we have subsidies for a few different reasons. Most typically, we're looking to increase production for goods that we want more of. Society wants more of, the government wants more of. Oftentimes, these are goods that are positive externalities. They have benefits that exceed their costs. Vaccines would be an example. Education, we might subsidize somebody's attendance in college. Those are all examples of subsidies. We also use subsidies to support agriculture. Sometimes, in the case of the last year, we saw a variety of agricultural subsidies that went to particular farmers, soybean farmers, for example, because they had been very affected by some of the tariffs. So after the tariff, there were subsidies to deal with the effects of the tariff. Sometimes subsidies also enable some producers, some farmers, to be more competitive with foreign countries. So subsidies is actually, it's a source of a lot of discussion and debate within, say, the World Trade Organization that might see subsidies as essentially a protective measure, in some cases making some industries, more competitive domestically. And a couple of examples of this, of course, agriculture like corn, giving farmers greater amounts of money, sometimes because the prices or the market prices may be low. Instead of price floors, we might see subsidies that actually could have a shift of the supply curve. Sometimes subsidies in agriculture can reduce the price even further if it's a per unit subsidy, so that can be problematic. Flu shots, wind-powered cars, interesting example, but certainly any type of good that we would want more of. A couple of things about subsidies. So here's an example. This is a very typical graph, usually just from a supply and demand perspective. If a firm, and of course we can also subsidize consumers, and that would affect the demand curve. For this example, we're looking primarily at producers. In the case of a subsidy that's per unit, we're looking at largely the supply curve shifting right. Okay, why is that the case? Because we're seeing the ability for each producer that's getting the subsidy, say a car producer that's making some sort of really renewable energy car, they're able to produce a greater quantity at every single price because of the increase in their per unit subsidy. One of the effects of this, so, if we look at the subsidy and we say, okay, this is going to be very much like the tax, the effects of the tax. We have a new equilibrium price, okay? But the story is a little bit more nuanced in terms of how the benefits of a subsidy might play out, okay? So prior to the subsidy, before the subsidy, there was price PE, the equilibrium price, okay? Both the consumer and the producer were benefiting, okay? And there was maximum producer and consumer surplus. The consumer surplus, of course, was here, okay? Everything with the price and then up to the demand curve, this would have been consumer surplus. Producer surplus would be everything here, okay? So this was kind of producer surplus. After the subsidy, okay, we're now at this equilibrium. So we see the price for the consumer, okay, actually be lower. And you might be thinking, well, that's a really good thing. Consumers like low prices, and to some extent this is true. If our consumer surplus was here, kind of everything right here in red, right? Now all of a sudden, we can even kind of showcase this, if this was our original consumer surplus, right? Now we're adding this to the consumer surplus, right? This entire area is gain consumer surplus when the consumer is paying price PC, okay? In addition to that, we might also have the producer, right? The producer surplus used to be everything here, okay? So this was our producer surplus. I'm just going to kind of estimate here. I know the supply curve is a little wacky and my ability to draw is a little wacky, but this is our producer surplus, okay? What happens when the supply curve shifts to the right? The consumer gets this lower price, okay? However, the producer isn't going to receive this lower price. The producer is going to receive the lower price from the consumer and then also be given a per unit subsidy for every single quantity, okay? And you can notice that the quantity as a result of the shift in supply has moved from quantity E to quantity 1, okay? Because the price has gone down, we now see a movement along the demand curve, greater quantity demanded, and we now have this new consumer price at a greater quantity of QE, okay? Q1 rather. The price that the producer is going to actually get would include the price the consumer is giving the producer, hand over the money to the producer to buy this car, and then the per unit subsidy is here, okay, the dollar amount for the per unit subsidy for every single quantity. So the producer is really effectively getting this price all the way up here. Okay, so if we compare the situation for the producer was getting this welfare, okay, but now as a result of the subsidy, like, wow, the producer is making out, much better. The producer is getting much more subsidy. Their producer welfare, rather, they are benefiting from the subsidy. So on one hand, we'd be like, okay, producer surplus, has increased, okay, consumer surplus has increased. Why is this inefficient, right? What's going on here, okay? Well, remember that the increase in consumer and producer surplus is adding to total welfare, but we also have something that is on the minus side, okay? And what might that be? It is going to be a negative government revenue, okay? So say that we now say, here's our producer price, okay? So we'll just kind of recreate this a little bit. Here's our producer price. Now, how much is going to be paid for this, right? The subsidy is not free. It comes from taxpayer dollars. So we can look at the way in which the let's make this green. The government is actually paying, okay, and this is what makes it a negative number. The government is going to be paying for every one of the quantity Q1, the government is dishing out a per unit subsidy, okay, of whatever that dollar amount is. Let's say, for argument's sake, it's $20, okay, so the per unit subsidy, 20 times every single one of Q1. So this giant square right here, okay, this kind of tells us what the, this is not government revenue, it's actually negative government revenue, okay? It's the cost of the subsidy, which is massive to the taxpayer, right? So this dollar amount, okay, of government revenue is actually more than the gains in producer and consumer surplus. If we look at the gains, if we take this whole entire box and say, okay, where did this come from, right? This negative government revenue, and let's imagine that it's like $400 or something like that. Well, some of it is going to the producer, okay? So the producer gets kind of some benefit that the government's paying for. So that's like a little bit of a wash, right here. And then we also have the consumer getting some of the benefit. Yeah, it's also kind of like a wash, right? The consumer is getting greater benefit, right? So this kind of area here is greater consumer surplus. The area up here is greater producer surplus. But lo and behold, right, we are left some degree of deadweight loss, okay? Where do we see deadweight loss? The deadweight loss is going to be right here. The size of the government payment for the subsidy is actually greater than the producer and consumer surplus increase, okay? So the difference between the two, the additional producer surplus, which of course makes the producers very happy, and if this is for a political purpose, that makes sense. For the consumers, who are also very happy and might be buying more of the good, and that may also be a good reason to have a subsidy, such as COVID vaccines. We may make it very affordable, so more people are likely to get it. But of course, in terms of efficiency, okay, we do have deadweight loss. This quantity of QE is still viewed as the equilibrium, or rather the allocatively efficient quantity. Once we have deadweight loss, we are actually not allocating our resources well. We are producing too much of the good. We may want to because we want to have increased consumer surplus or increased producer surplus, okay? But on a net efficiency level, we lose when we have deadweight loss, in terms of deadweight loss being equal to a certain dollar amount, right? The subsidy costs essentially more than we get in net benefit, okay? I hope that is helpful and kind of interesting. The maybe best way to see this is if I kind of switch to one, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh my. If I switch to one additional slide here, and this kind of shows you exactly what we were looking at. The producer surplus being the increase of AB. This is just laying it out in a nicer, prettier graph. The consumer surplus being the increase of CD, and the government cost for the subsidy really being A, B, C, D, E. And while A and B are going to the producer and C and D are going to the consumer, and maybe are very efficient, well worth the government's dollar, the money put in from taxpayers that would be equivalent to the area of E is actually the deadweight loss. Okay, so just wanted to show you a more clear graph. But